Okay, so we are going to talk about Gatsby and color theory and green light and how all of these things kind of work together. We're also going to talk about philosophy and we're going to talk about physics. So let's go ahead and get into it. Here we go. All right. So I thought that this particular image was really apropos when it comes to understanding um, the idea of the biggest, of course, of all of the colors in Gatsby, which is the color green. And this is a real ad that popped up on my Instagram feed. And so in order for us to kind of warm up today, we're going to analyze this together and pick it apart, not only for color, but also for message, right? As McLuhan says, the medium is the message. So the fact that this pops up on Instagram is really important because remember, when we think about the different social media platforms, they also have their own particular niche, right? Instagram is usually the type of media platform that people go to for escapism. They want like little tiny snippets of digestible information that is going to be fun, but also informative and to spark that kind of like dopamine hit, right? Um, if you look at other social media platforms, TikTok really relies upon dopamine. And then if you start going into like YouTube Shorts, that's where you get like a combination of dopamine and norepinephrine. And that's where you can kind of like go into these hyper focus spirals, right? But the fact that this particular one is on Instagram means that the goal of this is for them to capture your attention, but in a way that is supposed to be fun and lighthearted, as opposed to like, ooh, scary and that kind of thing, right? Okay. So let's go ahead and acknowledge the fact that this is supposed to be kind of like fun and uplifting. And we're just looking at the frame of this particular piece. And this is going to be important in a minute when we talk about Gatsby and the frame of the novel, right? Okay, so we're going to start with the idea of the fontage that we see here. All right. So we see this very like swirly, kind of like aristocratic kind of font, right? It's very much, it's got all of the feet on it. And so this is supposed to kind of evoke or provoke a feeling of class. But I want you to pay attention because this is actually kind of apropos for the rest of it, is that the letters in the second half that are there to actually make meaning so that it's not just a U and an M, those are actually supposed to invoke utility so that we can actually read what's being said, right? And then we have like a cocktail party in your inbox, but we pay you. Now, notice that this is italicized, all right? And normally, if we think about like italics, especially if you guys are used to doing text messages, italics used to, at least I'm an old person, so I don't know, maybe this isn't true anymore, but italics used to indicate sarcasm, right? In this instance, I don't think it's supposed to be sarcastic. I think that this person is trying to draw attention by leaning the text a certain way to draw the eye to it and make that particular fragment of a sentence stand out, right? That's ultimately the goal, all right? And it says, and we talk about money and status and taste, and we don't. Now notice that this one is not highlighted green, but it is also in italics, right? And we don't ogle your wife. If you don't know what the word ogle means, it means to stare at in kind of like a lusty, coveted way, okay? So nothing like a cocktail party, really. And this is interesting to me because, like, one of the biggest scenes, especially in chapter two, is the idea of the cocktail party. And what is the purpose of a cocktail party? Well, the purpose of a cocktail party is performative. It's supposed to show, hey, these are the people that I'm hanging around with. And so I'm going to perform my wealth for them, right? I'm going to show them just how much wealth I have or how much carefree I have, okay? And so this idea of coveting someone else's wife, the irony here when it comes to Gatsby, coveting someone else's wife is one of the downsides of being at a cocktail party. Like, look at how pretty my wife is. That's a status symbol. And like, we can go into the whole Marxist feminist critique here if we wanted to, but we're not gonna because we're just now getting into this. And I want to make sure that we have time for everything, right? In addition to that, you'll notice that we also have green, and this is supposed to be like a champagne bottle over here. All of the green is supposed to also represent the idea of wealth and money in a very performative fashion. Okay. And so when we're analyzing this, join free now, notice that it's free, right? But it's not free because ultimately, what are they using as currency? They're using attention as currency, right? We talk about the attention economy now. That's all social media is the attention economy. They're talking about attention, but attention really just boils down to time, right? Time and energy. And that's going to be important for our discussion about the idea of the color green, okay? When it says upper middle, that means that you are not considered socioeconomically speaking in the lower or working class, right? You are not the proletariat. You are the lower or working class. You're above that, okay? Middle management, white collar jobs, people who are like fairly college educated usually, and they're going to be in that like upper, or they're going to be in the middle class. Now, the middle class exists here, right? And then just above that, almost at the top socioeconomic status, almost there is this upper middle class. So they're kind of on this transition between being middle class, working class, just above that to almost at the point of high wealth status. Okay. So this is important when we start talking about the idea of hierarchy and money. Remember, we have two versions of the worlds that Nick Carraway is describing. He talks about old money, which is people who came from, across the oceans and brought with them money from whatever their previous country was, right? So like Spanish royalty or German royalty or, British aristocracy. They come over to the United States with money that they have from generations upon generations upon generations of wealth, right? And so they would be considered high socioeconomic status in an old sense. But we also have this other version, which is West Egg, and that's new money. And those are people who came to the United States, as immigrants and so on and so forth, and having those establish themselves there, they are new money because they have achieved the American dream in quotation marks, right? They've achieved success, but they've done it with the resources in the United States. Now, Nick is really interesting because his family, even though they don't really, they pretend that they're from like the Dukes of Buccleuch, right? So like they pretend that they're from Scottish royalty, even though they actually aren't. The way that they actually made money was through a hardware business because they sent a substitute to fight in the Civil War for them, right? And so they made money in the United States, but they did it in kind of like an awful way. Like they didn't want to even stand up for their own country's right to not have slavery. Like that's huge, right? That's a huge kind of like icky feeling that we have in the way that Nick's family has made money. Okay, so he would also be considered probably this our lens upon the world. He would be also considered this like upper middle class. But this is interesting because the impression of this particular advertisement that we're looking at is that you don't want to be upper middle class. What do you actually want to be? Well, in these parties, we talk about status and taste, right? And we pay you to have these conversations, okay? And it's like a cocktail party, but it's even better. All right. Jordan Baker says they're so private, right? So you're able to have access to these conversations, not to enrich your life, but in order for you to climb the ladder and get more money, right? Okay. So let's leave that there for a second. And the next thing that I want us to take a look at is the idea of color. Okay. And we're going to talk a little bit about how a prism works, but I want to show you a quick video that I think explains it far better. And if you don't remember, like when it comes to prisms, and we'll kind of hit on this a little bit in a minute too. When it comes to prisms, a prism is just like a piece of glass, right? And usually when you see a prism, it's like in a triangle shape and it's cool when light hits it and then the light spreads upon the wall and it breaks out the rainbow. And the rainbow that we almost always remember when it comes to color is Roy G. Biv, right? So like red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. How does that work in regards to physics? Well, that's going to be an interesting conversation because it has to do with time. But in order for you to understand that, and wavelength, but in order for you to understand that, I'm going to show you a quick video. So hang on one second. Let me pull it up. Okay, so we're going to watch this really quick.
Beam of light hits a piece of glass straight on. It passes right through it. But the waves that make up the light actually get slowed down by the glass and only go back to their normal speed when they come out the other side. That slowing down is what causes white light to split into a rainbow of colour whenever it hits glass on an angle. It happens because glass slows some colours of light more than others, and because slowing down on an angle makes light bend. It's easy to understand the bending if you picture how the light waves would look from above, like how waves at the beach look if you see them from the air. And while white light's made up of all the different colours of light, it also helps to look at them one colour at a time. When a wave front of red light hits glass on an angle, the part of the wave that enters the glass first gets slowed down before the rest, and that changes the angle of the whole wave, like how waves bend around a cliff. Violet light gets slowed down even more by glass, so its waves bend more. All the other colours get bent somewhere in between. So the colours get separated when they first enter the glass on an angle, and they spread out even more when they speed up on an angle as they leave. The reason the different colours slow down different amounts in glass is because they've got different wavelengths. Red light has the longest wavelength, followed by orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and finally violet with the shortest wavelength. And the shorter the wavelength, the longer it takes to travel through glass. That's because light interacts with electrons in the molecules that make up glass. Long wavelength light, like red, only interacts a bit with the electrons, so it doesn't get slowed much. But shorter wavelength violet light interacts more, so it gets slowed down more. So it's the combination of hitting glass on an angle and different wavelengths interacting with the electrons in the glass different amounts that makes light hitting a prism spread out into a beautiful spectrum of colour. And some classic album cover art.
I just love the way she says color. Like that accent is so fun. I love how she says color. Okay, so what does this all have to do with when it comes to Great Gatsby? So if we're thinking about the idea of red light, and by the way, we hear a lot of mention of like rose and rosy colored, and I don't think, and I again, this is me learning with you, right? I don't think that that necessarily has to do with the idea of the wavelengths of red being shorter in regards to time. We also have occasional references to the idea of violet, and violet being a longer. I don't necessarily know that that has to do with the wavelength being longer. One that we're going to really concentrate on is the idea of green. Notice that green is in the middle of the perspective, right? Or in the middle of the spectrum, right? So isn't that interesting if we think about the idea of the middle class? Now, one of the things that we see explored in The Great Gatsby a lot is the idea of the corruption of the American dream. And just as a quick refresher, when it comes to the American dream is going to be the idea that if you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, hang on, I'm drawing some boots with bootstraps. If you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you should be able to achieve quote unquote success no matter where you've come from, right? So you can come from anywhere and that success will be realized because you have worked hard and you have done what you're supposed to do. And therefore, America as a country is going to reward you with, some sort of success, right? And we talked about this before, but it's interesting to me the fact that we've got the concept of bootstraps, right? Because Marx talks a lot about the idea of shoes and how shoes kind of represent the problem that the working class has, okay? So the middle class American dream would be no matter who you are or where you come from, if you work really hard, eventually you will be able to achieve success. But let's talk about the idea of success for a moment. In the original Declaration of Independence, John Locke said that all people, that it is all men are created equal, and obviously we can go through and have a conversation about men being created equal and all of the problems therein, but we're going to save that for a different time. But all men are created equal, and therefore all men should have the right to life, liberty, And right now, your brain is probably filling in the next part of this with pursuit of happiness. But the original from John Locke was life, liberty, and property. But that was removed. And there's different conversations about why that was removed. Most historians agree that it probably have to do with the idea of slavery and how they didn't want certain people to like equate coming over to the United States with an automatic you get land, right? And we can also have a conversation about how like the land itself and Native Americans and like it wasn't anyone's land to begin with and John Locke is like, promising other people's land. But I want to talk instead about the idea of what it was changed to. So life, liberty, and then I can't do but double quotes. Let's do single quotes. The pursuit of happiness. And we are really going to dial into this word here. All right. Pursuit. If you are pursuing something, it means that you could never actually attain it, right? You are guaranteed not happiness. You are guaranteed to pursue happiness, okay? This is the middle of the rainbow, all right? And if you go slower, no, hang on. If you go slower, you're going to go here. If you go faster, you're going to go here. But maintaining this point means that you are constantly in a state of not quite there, not quite there. And that also brings us back to this warm up that we did that was like, hey, do you want to be there? Would you rather be old money? Would you rather be new money? Would you rather just be any kind of money, right? And so if we think about the idea of the green light, just having money itself isn't actually happiness. And that didn't work at all. So let's try that again. um, Having money itself isn't actually happiness. And we see that when we look at Tom and Daisy. They do have money, right? They've got all the money and they have old money. They literally don't even have to have jobs. Like Daisy flounces around the room and says it's the longest day. I never know I never know what's the longest day. And then I try to mark it and I always forget. Why doesn't she know it's the longest day? Because she doesn't have to work, right? She doesn't have to like take her time and divvy it up and have things like weekends and like vacations because she doesn't have to work because she comes from old money. So her concept of time is already in this like long white, moment of purity because in her opinion, what is time anyway, right? And that in of itself, you might go, oh my gosh, I would love that, right? But it's also kind of sad because she's trapped in this world in which she isn't really given purpose. She has a child and she says, I hope that she's a beautiful little fool. That's the best thing that a girl can be is a beautiful little fool because Daisy herself is so nihilistic that like even the way that she spends her time feels purposeless, right? It feels purposeless. So her pursuit of anything has kind of been cut off, right? She doesn't have much to pursue anymore because the whole idea of the American dream is to pursue happiness. And happiness, as defined in this particular era for most people, and watch what I'm saying here, for most people is money. So, happiness for many people is supposed to be this concept of I will be happy when I have enough money. All right. And I used to do this thing with my kids in school, and we started this conversation where I asked them, hey, let's say that you are, 33 years old and you're successful. What does success look like to you? And the majority of kids that I talked to were like, well, I have a nice house and I have a nice car and I have a job that I love and I have, like a loving family and maybe a couple of kids and a couple of dogs. And other than the loving family and the couple of kids and the couple of dogs, the majority of things that they cited as being success are material things. And that's not their fault. Like that's, of course, that makes sense, right? But if we talk about the idea of material success, then that really does limit your ability to think broadly. Okay. So happiness in the United States at this time was largely defined on a monetary scale. All right. How much money do you have? Do you have enough to be able to party? If you have enough to be able to party, are they super cool parties? Right. That was kind of like, and remember too, they're like on the edge of war. So everyone's kind of nihilistic at this point. Okay. So let's move away from that. I also want you to remember too, if we think about the color green, and we'll get more into this in a second. If we think of the color green, I want you to start associating the color green with Gatsby, but I don't want you to associate the color green with Gatsby for money. Instead, I want you to associate the color of green with Gatsby for the idea of happiness. And we'll explain why in just a second. So hang on one second. I'm going to open up a new one of these guys, and then we're going to get into it. Okay. So the last little annoying thing I'm going to make you go through before we actually get into this is I'm going to play for you a sketchnoting activity that I did, and we're only going to listen to just a teeny tiny little snippet of it because it's also going to be important when we talk about the idea of how we internally interpret color. Okay. Trigger warning. This is from a Radiolab episode and they talk about Sir Isaac Newton and there is some violence with an eyeball. So if you are worried about the idea of like eyes and pokings and things like that, you can fast forward the video. I will basically give you like a signal. You can watch me so you can fast forward the video, but I'll give you a signal that basically says, okay, when you see that on your screen, then you can go ahead and restart it because I know that at one point in time, it's like, oh, I don't want to do that. So if eyeballs and like poking of eyeballs is like not your thing, go ahead and just fast forward now. And then you can find the spot in the video that says, okay. Otherwise, if you want to stay with me, this is really interesting too. All right, so let's do the second half of this.
This is Jim Glick.
Hey, how are you?
Fine, how are you?
Pretty good, pretty good. Rainbows, rainbows. Okay, so we're going to start today with author James Glick.
As I recall, you wanted to talk about Isaac Newton.
That's right.
We did call him to talk about Isaac Newton, but more specifically, colors.
All right, Isaac Newton, he's 23 years old.
1665.
And he's home for the holidays. No, there's no holiday. He's home for the plague.
There was actually a plague. They sent everybody home from school. In any case, he's in his room, famously solving all these mysteries of the world. And one of the questions that he thinks about during this break is,
what are colors? Where do they come from?
Like, when I see the color red, is it inside my head, or is it something that exists sort of out there in the world?
Is the light without, or is the light within? So he pokes a knife into his eye.
What?
What do you mean?
Here's what Newton wrote in his notebook.
I took a bodkin, put it betwixt my eye and the bone, as near to the back side of my eye as I could,
Oh,
and pressing my eye with the end of it, there appeared several white, dark, and colored circles.
did that lead him to some conclusion about where the spots live, whether they're outside or inside?
No, this didn't get him very far.
Because seeing spots when you poke your eye doesn't tell you much about what color is.
But
what he
just a
did
few
next
years later-
did, and this one he's a little more famous for.
He got himself a prism, which is just a bit of glass shaped like a pyramid.
It wasn't so easy for him to get his hands on a prism, but he did.
Then he shut his blinds so the room was totally dark, but he poked a little hole in one of the blinds. And then he waited,
The sun had to be at just the right angle.
and he waited. And when the sun got to just the right spot, a ray of light shot through the room. Newton immediately stuck his prism into the light, and the light shattered and became
A rainbow on the wall.
Or, in Newton's own words,
a coloured image of the sun. Now that's gorgeous, isn't it? A coloured image of the sun.
that's Victoria Finley. She wrote a book about color, and she says the thing to understand about this experiment is that at the time, people believed that white light,
It was given by God or given by this amazing thing called nature.
The light from the sun was sort of holy.
Yeah.
If there was anything that was pure, it was white.
so when the prism did the rainbow thing, which people knew prisms did, they just figured,
The colors are in there in the glass.
in other words, that rainbow had nothing to do with the light itself. That was just the prism.
Adding some kind of impurities to the light.
Oh, wow. I hadn't thought of the possibility that the prism is muddying the light. It's polluting the light.
Well, how do you know that the prism isn't generating these colors?
Yes.
So he got a second prism, and this was the trick.
While the first prism was still making that rainbow on the wall,
He moved a few feet away, and he held up a second prism in the blue area to see what would happen to the blue light.
would the prism add more colors to the blue light?
Or would it be transformed in some other way? And what he found was nothing happens. It remains blue.
So he thought, if the blue light isn't getting muddied by the prism, then maybe the prism wasn't muddying the white light to begin with. Maybe that rainbow of colors was actually coming from inside the white light.
He inferred that the first prism is dividing light into its constituent parts.
Which means that the white light we see around us is actually constituted of all of these colours.
The colors were in the light. They are the light. He had his answer. Light is a physical thing in the physical world. You can tweak it, test it, study it. This was the beginning of everything we know about light today.
Which Newton put us on the road toward finding.
That ultraviolet rays, X-rays, radio waves, they're all different energies of light. And colors are just energies within that little sliver that we can see. And that has led to our understanding of the greenhouse effect, knowing what stars are made of, even the age of our own universe.
But not everybody was pleased by this.
Well, a little bit later, John Keats, a romantic poet, was really cross with him in a poem because they said he removed all the poetry of the rainbow.
And the real challenge to Newton's view of color, one that would really stick, oddly enough, it did come from a poet, not Keats, but the poet named Goethe.
Yeah, here's this German romantic poet.
That is author Jonah Lehrer.
Regular with us, who writes about this kind of thing and always wonderfully.
One day he is walking in the park and he spots these yellow crocuses. And he looks at the yellow crocuses and admires their petals. It's early spring and they're blooming. And then he quickly turns away.
And in an instant, he suddenly sees
this dash of violet cross his eyes.
He still sees the shape of the flower, but now it's violet. It's the opposite of yellow. He hadn't rubbed his eye, he hadn't stuck a needle in it, and yet, there it was.
It seemed just as real.
As real as the yellow crocus.
And yet he knew it wasn't real. It came from inside his mind. And it was, it's something, we've all hallucinated colors. You can press on your eyeball or close your eyes and you see this riot of fireworks. But for Goethe, that simple observation leads him to think that maybe color isn't simply about the external universe, and maybe our perception of colors began in the world, but maybe it was finished inside the mind.
And today, hundreds of years later, this is still an open question.
A scientist can say color.
Okay, so I'm going to stop this really quickly and just kind of wrap up. Okay, so hang on. Let me signal to my people. Okay, so hopefully you're able to come back to me after like that and just avoiding it, okay? Okay, so basically what we found out in that little sketch note is that the idea of color is both inside and also outside ourselves, right? What does that matter? Well, if we're thinking about the idea of what happiness is and what the American dream is, all of those things have to do with the concept of time. Time is really important when it comes to the waves because the waves are separated into, either shorter waves or longer waves, and the way that we perceive color is also the amount of time that the color takes to go through that particular prism. And when Newton found out about the idea of color and he starts to understand color in the way that he does, he comes to understand that the colors that exist are not what people previously thought. The idea of the color of God was the white light of God, pure, unbridled white light of God. To borrow from Emily Dickinson, the soul at the white hot heat. Okay, so the concept of white light was supposed to be the idea of holiness. And when I say God, I don't want you to think just necessarily of one particular type of God. There were a lot of people at the time period that said nature is God, and like the idea of like being out into, the world and just experiencing the natural world. That was also a pathway to God. Okay. And so this is really interesting. Sorry, I just realized I didn't have my timer on. This is really interesting because Newton basically says that the colors that exist are not about impurities, right? So if we see blue, that doesn't mean that the white light of God has become impure in some way, shape, or form. It means that the waves have slowed down and our eyes are perceiving it in a different way. It's also really interesting in that little podcast that we listen to when we hear the idea that understanding something scientifically speaking could potentially, as Keats said, ruin the beauty of the transcendental nature of being in color, right? Seeing color and all of those things. You have basically removed the poetry of the rainbow. Keats got super mad about that. Okay. Now, Goethe says, now, wait a minute here. If you're saying that everything is scientific, and because everything is scientific, that means that we can no longer see the poetry of something, I think you're wrong because, and he talks about the idea of like perceiving the shadow of color. If you've ever like walked out into the world after being in a movie theater all day, you know, like in a darkened room or something all day, and you walk out into the world and everything is like super bright, and then you turn back and you still see the like purple shadows of what it is that you previously saw because they're like etched on the back of your eye and all that kind of good stuff. That means that color in and of itself exists within our perception, right? That we have these like shadows of colors that we looked at, especially if they're like super, super bright, and they're actually in our mind's eye. So perception is also important, okay? So, when we talked about the idea of the green light with Gatsby, the reason that I want you to associate the concept of the green light with Gatsby is because it's the concept of pursuing Gatsby's form of happiness. All right. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay. So we're going to do a quick little breakdown when it comes to color symbolism in The Great Gatsby. And then I'm going to really spend a lot of time on the color green because that's the one that I think is the most interesting. So let's start with the perception of blue. All right. So blue almost always in Gatsby is going to be the idea of enlightenment, but also the sadness that comes with enlightenment. Okay. Kind of taking it back to the idea of what Keats said about the poetry of the rainbow. Okay. So if I'm aware that the system that is in place isn't a great system, then that means that I might become disenfranchised or I might become nihilistic about the system. We see this with Daisy. When Daisy says, I hope that she's a beautiful little fool, she is enlightened, but the enlightenment that she has is a very kind of jaded and awful one. So Daisy basically recounts her birth story with her daughter, and her husband is off God knows where, which we might be able to infer mean that he's off with a woman, right? So he's off at God knows where, and she wakes up from the ether, which in and of itself is also like that was a thing that they used to do back in the day. Like you just wake up out of, you know, a drug-induced sleep, and they would hand you a baby, and like that's also kind of traumatizing. And Daisy basically says, I hope that she is too ignorant, non-enlightened, not blue. I hope that she's too ignorant to know just how trapped she is, right? She says, I hope she's a beautiful little fool. If she's beautiful, then that means that this world that she is birthed into will take care of her because pretty girls get taken care of and ugly girls get forgotten, right? And if she's beautiful and she's a fool, then she won't want to have anything other than the pretty objects of capitalism. She won't want anything other than the pretty parties and the pretty cars and the pretty houses and all of those pretty things, right? She won't need any of that because she's a fool. She's too ignorant to care about those things, all right? So enlightenment and sadness go together with the idea of blue, and that kind of makes sense, right? Like emotionally speaking, if we think about the idea of blue, blue is like a beautiful blue sky, but also you can have the blues, okay? And we're not going to get into music in this one, but we'll get into the music in the future one. The idea of yellow and gold is also really interesting, and this is where we kind of go back to the idea of impurity. So remember, white is supposed to be the white light of enlightenment, but yellow would be tainted enlightenment. Okay. So, like, all the colors together equal white. Okay. And because all of the colors together equal white, that could be the white light of God. That could be the white light of enlightenment. It could be the white light of like purity. All right. But when there is one tiny aspect of white that gets tainted, maybe you have one piece of dirt that gets into a glass of milk, right? Or you have like a little piece of, I shouldn't say dirt, I should say cocoa. You have a little bit of cocoa that gets into like a glass of milk, it taints it. So yellow, when we hear yellow, yellow is tainted purity. Okay. And I know right now you're like, wait, is this racial purity? And take it to Tom, right? The conversation that Tom had with Daisy at the dinner table where we find out just how awful Tom is when he starts talking about all that racist stuff. And we're just like, oh, right. Like everyone's like, oh my God, what? The colored empire? What are you talking about? Right. So like we're kind of like blown away by how awful that is. But the idea of tainted purity is the idea of yellow. Now, this is really important if we're thinking back to the concept of white, right? So if white is all the colors together and the blinding light of God, or if you want to, Plato's allegory of the cave, the blinding light of Plato's allegory of the cave, then that means that the yellow and also the gold that's associated with money is also a tainted construct, right? So let's take Daisy the flower. Remember, her name is Daisy. A daisy on the outside is white, and in the middle, it's yellow. That's what a daisy flower looks like. And if you're like, I thought that it had red petals and a black center, that's a black-eyed Susan. And I know because it's my mom's favorite flower. So that a daisy is white on the outside, so she looks pure, she looks perfect, she looks all of these things. But on the inside, she's yellow and corrupted. Same thing with an egg. On the outside of an egg, it is white, and on the inside, it has the yolk, right? Which is yellow. And so if we're thinking about the idea of these groups of people that are either the super rich that are old money or the super rich that are new money, it doesn't matter. Both of them represent the idea of tainted purity or tainted enlightenment, right? Or tainted, blinding light of God. Okay. If we're thinking about those ideas, the reason that it's important has to do with the concept of gold. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and just jump down here. We'll come back to black and rose and pink and those things. But let's go ahead and we're going to jump down to the idea of green. Okay. So we hear at the end of chapter 1 that Gatsby is talking about the green light. And if I say green light and the first thing that you think of is green light go, right? So like you're playing a game and it goes green means go, yellow means slow, and then red means stop. That actually can be a great way for you to kind of understand this concept as well. Green means go. And if you're driving, if you're a driver, you know that sometimes if you're sitting at a red light and a green light pops on, we have a tendency to, without even thinking, we just like go. And sometimes, accidentally, the green is not for us. It's a green turning signal and we're in the straight lane. And so we have to stop ourselves really quickly. But it's important to remember that we think about the idea of the green light. Green means progression. Go, 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 go. Go without thinking, go without questioning. Green means go. Green means progress. Green means money. Green means greed. Sometimes we talk about the idea of greed. Green means all of those things, but it's consumption, 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 consumption. Go, go, go. Progress, progress, progress. Okay. If we tell people that the reason that we have founded a country is so that everyone has equal access to the pursuit of happiness, but we never define what happiness is, then how are they supposed to know what happiness is? If we say to someone, hey, success and happiness looks like having a giant house with a big green lawn and, 2 cars and 3.5 kids and, a job that you don't have to work too hard on so that you can go on vacations at least 3 times a year. All of those things are tied to money, right? Gold, which is like, if we're thinking about the idea of the different, and I'll let you, as we go through this, I want you to kind of track it in your book. But one of the things that we hear is the idea of gold and cars and things like that. Gold is a physical way to track money, right? And instead of like, dollars and things like that, if we think about the idea of something plated in gold, like a gold plated toilet, right? Or gold plated silverware, or even like pure gold silverware, what have you, right? Gold is supposed to represent money, but gold is also the tainted white of pure enlightenment. So the reason that Gatsby is super, super interesting is that Gatsby is not pursuing money because he wants happiness. He's not pursuing money because he's like, oh, if I have money, then that means that I'm going to be happy. No, 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 no. Gatsby is pursuing money because Gatsby ultimately wants love. That's what Gatsby wants. He wants love. And so his idea of happiness isn't the idea. Oh, maybe that's the rose pink. Think I just found something. Okay. So his idea of happiness isn't the idea of like I'm gonna have like a like the best house and all of those things and like the big, the big car and the big parties and all of those things. Those things he does and he performs them, but he performs them for a higher pursuit. What is the higher pursuit? Happiness that is love, specifically the happiness that is Daisy. Now, and if right now you're like, oh, it's a love story. Wait, wait, wait. I'm going to mess it up for you because when it comes to what he views as Daisy, Daisy is an object for him. And when we get to the chapter of him and his platonic conception of self, we'll talk about all of that. Okay. So the amount of time that Gadsby spends in creating for himself a platonic conception of himself, he does those things not because he wants to be Instagram famous, not because he wants to show off his wealth to other people. He does it for one sole purpose, and the one sole purpose is Daisy. All right. And that means that the time that he is devoting to this capitalist American dream game, those are not for impure reasons, right? His pure reason, and that's why Gatsby, Nick says that Gatsby turned out all right in the end, right? It's what preyed upon Gatsby, what foul dust, right? And the foul dust is the foul dust of capitalism, the system of capitalism. The Great Gatsby is a capitalist critique, and if you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is socialism, right? If like right now you're panicking for that, like that's fine. Have those conversations, do all of those feelings, but this book is a critique of capitalism. And one of the aspects of the critique of capitalism that we have here is the idea that you are devoting your entire life to attaining material objects. And in so doing, you are alienating yourself, right? That goes back to Marx's boots, okay? So the idea that you basically use up the majority of your life, like 65 years to 70 years, depending on what country you're in, just trying to accumulate wealth. And by the time you get enough wealth to actually live a life, you're 65 to 70 years old, which means that physically it's very difficult for you to actually enjoy it. And Marx's boots are a metaphor of that. That was actually in a previous lecture, so you can check that out in my previous lecture about Marxist boots. So when we're thinking about the idea of the green light for Gatsby, it is not only that Gatsby is reaching for monetary progress, it is that he's reaching for monetary progress that cannot actually that does not actually go towards I want to show this off so that I can like show other people how much power and status I have, right? The only reason that he wants power and status is money is because he's pursuing Daisy, okay? We do hear some stuff talking about the idea of darkness and black. And when those kind of things come, I want you to think more about the idea of consciousness. Normally we think of like darkness and black in literature, archetypally speaking, to be perfectly clear, as the idea of like evil. But in this instance, we don't really hear that much about it. A little bit of death, but not that much. And then rose and pink. And this is actually something that I've talked about with my students a lot. I've kind of sent them on a mission to try to figure this out, but I think I might have just like done something there. But anyway, rose and pink to me, we hear it associated a lot with the idea of romantic notions. At one point in time, Daisy looks at Nick and says, "You're just a rose, you're a pure rose." And that's the same scene in which Daisy and Jordan are described as being these white sails that basically float around the room, right? And we think about those ideas as, being them looking like purity and enlightenment and all of those things. But then on the inside, Daisy reveals that she's like extremely nihilistic and kind of awful. And Jordan is also like not great either, right? So if we think about those ideas, they look white on the outside and they're yellow on the inside. The fact that all of this is taking place at the longest day of the year, like this is the inciting incident. And Nick actually says that, like in the chapter, he says the moment that all of this started with my dinner that I had with Daisy and Tom. So the first scene in chapter 1 where they have this terrible dinner party, right? The first scene that we have in chapter 1, we see that the twilight is rose, right? And we hear this description of like how everything is rosy and the rose-colored carpet and all of those other things. And so I want to make a connection with the idea of rose and like Shakespeare, and a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. I think, and this is just me, I feel like rose and pink are supposed to be the idea of romantic understandings of the world, but maybe not pure romantic. Like maybe the idea of rose and twilight is supposed to be the idea of like it looks rosy. So if you've ever heard someone describe, I look at the world with rosy colored glasses, the idea that the way that we look around the world is going to without that, with lack of a better term, color our perception, right? Okay, so the last thing that I want to mention when it comes to the idea of green, well, not the last thing, but almost the last thing, is that we, at the end of chapter one, see Gatsby reaching out across the bay. And Nick is like, I think that it's something that's over near Daisy's house, but I can't really see. But he's reaching, and like his hand is quivering as he's reaching. And the only thing that Nick can figure out that he's reaching for is the green light. Two big things to think about this. One, the fact that he's reaching from where he stands in the new money district to the old money version of Daisy. So he's reaching out for Daisy, and he is in one particular position that he cannot change. Gatsby will never be old money. He cannot be old money because to be old money, you have to be birthed into it. You have to come from familial wealth, right? Tom Buchanan is old money. He's like polo horses money, as Caraway describes him. Okay, so he's old money, and Gatsby is new money. And at the end of chapter one, we don't know how he makes his money, but we know that he is new money. So he's reaching out from his position and he cannot move. He's like literally as close as he can possibly get. The second thing is he's reaching towards a green light, and you can't hold on to light. You can't touch it. You can't grab it. You can't hold on to it. You can pursue it. You can reach for it. You can try and get it, but you're never actually going to touch it. Money you can touch. Cars you can touch. Lawns you can touch, all of those things that you can touch. When it comes to love, you can't touch it. When it comes to light, you cannot touch it. You can reach out and you can try and touch it, but you can't actually touch it. Okay. All right. I'm going to stop the video here because I'm about to go into the idea of lawns, and I'm going to bring you a little bit of snippet from Anthropocene Reviewed, which is John Green, and how all of those things layer on together. But this video is pretty long, so I'm going to stop it here. If you care to, we'll move into the next video and take a look at what I say about the idea of lawns and how this is also the idea of a status symbol in the United States.